English language to listen to. Repito en español, tenemos traducción simultánea para aquellos que quieran elegirla. Está en la barra que está acá abajo y pueden escuchar en el idioma de su interés. Now I want to introduce Anthony Bright. We are so happy to have you here with us, Anthony. He is one of the most distinguished educational specialists in the United States. He is the ex-president of the Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching. He was part of the Chicago Consortium for School Research, an initiative that undertook incredibly important research to understand the school reform and improvement. Thank you, Anthony, and welcome to SILED, to Chile, to our webinar. We are very happy to have you here.
It's my pleasure to join you today. My regrets that the previous time we tried to do this, we got our time schedules a little confused and I missed being able to join you then, but I'm delighted to be here today. I am going to try to share my screen with you. So if you just have a bit of patience with me while I try to get this set up, and then hopefully we can get started.
Thank you very much, Anthony.
Oops, that doesn't look like the right one. So let me try again. All right, now I think we're good. And,
yes.
Let me get this into presenter view. And does this look okay?
Yes, that's perfect.
All right. In my talk today, I like to share with you the principles that anchor what I call living improvement. And I want to do this by sharing two different stories of improvement in which I had the privilege of playing a significant role. And through these stories, help to illuminate what we call the 6 principles of improvement that anchor this work. And then I'll conclude my talk by quickly summarizing. The one other thing I would say as we just begin this conversation is that doing work of this sort is a fundamental challenge, represents a fundamental challenge to how we've tried to advance improved student outcomes in the past. Quite simply now, all of us who are engaged in this work are improvers now. I want to begin with a story. It's a public health parable that actually opens this book called Upstream by a good colleague of mine, Dan Heath. And let me read you this opening story. You and a friend are having a picnic by the side of a river. Suddenly, you hear a shout from the direction of the water. A child is drowning. Without thinking, you both dive in, grab the child, and swim back to shore. Before you can recover, you hear another child crying out for help. You and your friend jump back in the river to rescue that child as well. Then another struggling child drifts into sight, and another, and another. The two of you can barely keep up. Suddenly, you see your friend wading out of the water, seeming to leave you alone. Where are you going, you demand? Your friend answers, I'm going upstream to tackle that guy who's throwing all of these kids into the water. The key lesson in this parable is that often we need to go upstream to truly understand the problems we actually have to solve. Let me go to my first story. For almost 20 years, I worked on school improvement in the city of Chicago. Here was one of the big problems we sought to tackle. Every year, 20,000 students would start high school. Every year, 10,000 of those students would eventually drop out. Looking at dropouts is a little bit like standing downstream. They're out of the system. They've been tossed away, in essence. we need to go back upstream. What's happening to those students as they go into high school that may actually be causing some of this problem to emerge? We begin the work by starting out with what are the prevailing explanations of educators in high schools? And they quite rightfully point out that, well, many of the students coming in don't have the skills required to do high school work. And they lament that students lack motivation. They cut classes, they're absent, they don't do their homework. The educators care about these students and try to intervene. It's like wading into that stream, trying to save some of those students who are drowning. But they lament there's nothing we really can do. That's what they believe. Well, what improvement research encourages us to do is to go upstream. Go upstream in this case means we need to understand this problem a little bit better, a little bit more deeply. Well, one way we do this in improvement work is we engage in something called empathy interviews. We go out and we talk to the students themselves. How are they making sense of what's happening to them? Because we see it through our eyes, but we don't necessarily see it through their experiences. So we go talk to students and we look at data at students, particularly in this case, as students move from grade 8, that's the end of our elementary schools in the United States, into high school, grade 9. So what do we learn when we do this? Well, many of those students who are struggling in grade 9, they were coming to school regularly in grade 8. They were attending regularly. 6 months later, they're cutting classes and they're absent. So they were present and now suddenly they're not present. Some of those students did have basic skills, weaknesses, but many of these students were on grade level in 8th grade, and yet 6 months later, they're failing core academic courses in high schools. So they seem to have the basic skills necessary to succeed, but they're not. And then as we talk to the students, what do we learn? Well, the transition to high school is a big transition. In elementary schools, they typically had 1 or 2 teachers who actually knew them well. In high school, they may have 6 teachers, each teacher or 7. Each teacher teaches a particular course and thinks about themselves as a subject matter expert, but they may not connect very well to the individual students because they're only with them typically for a short period of time. So the students don't feel very well connected to adults. And in some cases, there may be other issues such as a little sense of being unsafe, maybe in school or certainly coming to and from school. So we're beginning to understand a little bit more deeply what's really going on with the students whom we seem to be losing. So this is an important part of doing improvement work, trying to more deeply suspend judgments about what you think you know and try to more deeply understand this experience through this, in this case, the students who are actually living it. So what did we do? Well, given what we now understood the problems to be, that began to shape a set of improvement activities to begin to work on. First of which is we had to see these students. At that point in time, there was a lot of aggregate data, so average daily attendance data, average percentage of students passing particular courses. But we didn't actually see individual students. So we needed to have a data system that we eventually called On Track, where you actually had information on every student in every school and was regularly accessible to the educators in every school building, because they didn't have that information to begin with. So part was a data problem. What the students had told us, they didn't feel necessarily connected to the adults in the school. So how could you go about creating a situation where every student was well known by at least one teacher in the school? That became an improvement goal. And then since the teachers only saw the students through the classes they taught, no one actually saw the totality of what the students were experiencing, that suggested creating what they call freshman on-track faculty teams, where all of the faculty who taught particular students could share what their experiences were with that student. So all of them now could benefit from a broader understanding. And then there were some key policies that they needed to look at, like grading policies if students weren't completing homework on time, how policies around indiscipline were treated in the school, and whether they worked against actually keeping students regularly enrolled and so on. So the group began to focus attention on how some key policies were actually pushing, in some sense, pushing students into that river. So this was not a program, but rather a sustained continuous improvement effort. As educators came to understand better what students were actually experiencing, it began to raise additional issues that needed to be thought about and particular processes that needed improvement. So that was the what of the work. How did they actually do the work? A small group of my colleagues, researchers in the Consortium on School Research, John Easton and Melissa Roderick, organized what we would now call a networked improvement community. They connected up with the heads of a small number of schools who now began to believe that maybe we can really do something about this problem, and the educators in these schools. And so a small group began to form, and we're going to tackle this problem of, could we keep more students on track for success? So that's the early stages of the forming of a networked improvement community. This hub that began to form that invited in some like-minded principals and teachers who really wanted to work on this problem. The idea was they would start small, be a kind of small group, but the premium was on learning fast. How do we actually, how to deepen that understanding about the problem, and how to try some changes we might introduce and gather data from those changes about whether they were pushing us in the right direction. In the course of doing this work, they basically did three things. They had this compelling idea: can we keep more students on track as they come into high school and therefore increase their success later on? But how do you move from a compelling idea like that to a set of processes, routines, and tools that would actually allow you to execute on this more productively? So they're learning how to do that. This early group of educators who are involved in this are also learning how to make all of this work in schools every day with faculty and students. So they're developing the kind of expertise in solving this problem that can now help them become teachers and mentors to other educators in other schools. So we're starting to build some resources for spreading the work. And this initial group of educators also become evangelizing leaders, because they now see through their work, working in different ways, that they can actually make a difference in the lives of their students. So that we've now built resources for the spread of this work over time. And then as this early work starts to show some success, the school system itself, system leaders, become much more engaged in the work. They learn about the work. They're talking about this work all the time. The supervisors of principals are now regularly having conversations with school heads and lead teachers about how they're thinking about on-track work in their schools and what they're doing. And so this movement is spreading over time. And so this continuously improving journey on graduation rates has emerged. And then what actually happened? Well, in the early years when this work is first starting, 2008, 2009, and 10, again, it's very small. And we have the initial on-track rates. This is for the whole of the city of Chicago. And the on-track rates in ninth grade, that's data on students who are attending regularly and passing core academic courses, are in the upper 50 percentile range. And then notice they start to increase and continue to increase year after year. And in tandem with that, 4 years later, the graduation rates also begin to increase. Where the system historically had graduation rates in the low 50% range, some 10 years later, the system was now approaching an 80% graduation rate. So it had made an improvement at a very large scale, from starting small, targeting in on a specific set of problems to solve, and then spreading this learning over time across all of the city of Chicago. That's my first story. Second one. This was work I began when I shifted from Chicago to become president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And we began to focus in on a different problem: the high failure rates in developmental math courses in our community colleges in the United States. The community colleges are the lowest tier within our tertiary educational system. This is typically where our students from our low-income families go. Many of our students of color go into community colleges. Students from families where neither parent has had a post-secondary education, they go to our community colleges. About half of the students in the United States go to these community colleges. Of the students who go to community colleges, 60 to 70% of the students are immediately assigned into these developmental math courses. And what we know is that 80% of the students will never acquire a college math credit. They never get through this gatekeeper to opportunity. If you don't pass a college math course, you can't acquire a 2-year degree. You can't transfer to a 4-year institution. Your path even to a number of technical preparation programs is blocked. And the other thing we know is that we send in the United States 500,000 students a year down this pathway. They go into these traditional courses, and the vast majority of them will never complete a college math requirement. This takes us to a fundamental insight in improvement work. If we continue to do what we've always done, we will continue to get what we've always gotten. So that's the problem we situated ourselves on. Could we really break open this gatekeeper and create opportunities for many more students to pursue their education and advance their welfare going forward? Well, as we started this, we began by looking around, well, what are the colleges doing? And they were doing a variety of things. There were a variety of special programs they were adding. Others were trying financial incentives and accountability initiatives. There was a lot of investment in counseling and advising services. Others were trying some technology, adding some technologies into this system. All of this was well-intentioned, but there was really little evidence about whether any of these things were actually working. And there was actually a bigger problem. If you look at this list of things that we saw colleges trying to do, there's a noticeable absent in this list. There's very little in this that's actually about the students engaging faculty around the specific subject matter that we're trying to get them to learn. There's very little about the core of instruction. What's actually happening to students in these math classes? So we have here what we refer to in improvement work as encountering solutionitis. As a big problem emerges, we immediately run out to try things, but we don't necessarily, again, deeply understand the problem we're trying to solve, nor do we know whether these things we're trying are actually making an improvement. We typically don't have much evidence about what they're doing or what they're accomplishing or what they're not accomplishing. All right, so what do? We take a step back. Again, we go to look at data. Well, what does this look like for students? And typically the students have to go through a sequence of 3 courses. And when we look at data, we find out that we're actually losing more students between the courses then are failing within the courses. So the way we've organized instruction, the scheduling of students through courses actually is part of the problem. Students actually can learn the material, but the scheduling is a problem. All right. And then we're looking at the kind of work students are being asked to do. And a lot of it is learning algorithms to solve problems like this. And the students are asking, well, why do I need to learn this? These are adults now. These are not young children. They're adults. They're preparing for the world of work. And they're asking, where will I ever use this? And the answer is, in most cases, they never will. So there's a question about, are we actually preparing them through the right content? And then we're looking at, what do they actually experience in classrooms? And it's a pretty passive form of instruction. Teacher up front lecturing, writing notes on the board. Students are sitting there passively. Often they don't even feel comfortable asking questions. So something about the nature of instruction we need to attend to. And then there's the mindsets of the students themselves as we talk to them. Many of them have never felt that they were very good at math. They think about themselves as, I'm not a math person. They're first generation college going students, so they're not certain they belong in college. And so there's a whole set of issues around the social psychology of engagement for the students that we have to attend to. So with this understanding, it's clear that it's not just one problem, but there are a number of different things that we might have to attend to if we're actually going to make progress. So this sets us on this path of beginning to develop what we call a working theory of improvement. If we really want to move that success rate, the aims of this improvement work, we begin to focus on, well, we got to focus in on four things. We have to focus in on the nature of instruction. We have to think about what we're going to do to help develop students' skills and maintain a positive mindset that with effort you can succeed. For many of the students, English is not their first language, and so there's some language and literacy problems embedded in the tasks and the texts that students have to read in the assignments, so we need to pay attention to that. And we're basically asking faculty to teach new subject matter in new ways, and so we have to figure out how to support them to learn how to do all of these things. And we call each of these a primary driver of improvement. And then the question is, well, how are we going to do this? How do we, so for example, on the instructional system, we know we got to reduce the transitions that I talked about before. So what we're going to do is create an integrated pathway, a cohort of students who start out together in the beginning of an academic year. Those students stay with the faculty member. They're enrolled for a whole year of instruction. And the aim at the end of the year is that you will earn a college level math credit. So we've created a social unit that share a valued aim, college math credit. So integrated math pathway. And we're also going to pay attention to what the content of that instruction is, how we make instruction more problem-based so that students can see the interest and relevance in the material. So we've now got a little kind of working theory about what we're going to do in that space. Another example, on the productive persistence, one of the things we learn early on is that when students begin to pull back, like this is not for me, they actually detach early on. It tends to happen in the first 2 weeks of instruction. Normally we don't see this because all we see is data at the end of the semester. But so we got to focus on starting strong, and we're introducing some additional concerns there to attend to. And then, all right, then we got this starting strong idea. Well, how are we going to change what the experience of student is like in those first 2 weeks? And so that leads us in turn to a set of very specific change ideas about, well, what are those opening lessons like? There is a direct intervention that had some evidence to it that you could actually change students from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. So let's add that. And how do we gather real-time data on how well students are doing in those first few classes that tells us about whether they're staying engaged or not? So there's a data piece to this. And finally, there's this idea of we want to build a classroom community where students feel connected to their student colleagues and to their instructor. And all of that tends to happen in the first couple of weeks as well. So that what I'm beginning to sketch out here are parts of what we call a working theory of improvement, where there's a whole set of change ideas, these little blue boxes, where we're going to try some things, and we're going to gather data, and we're going to try to make them work better over time. So we're doing continuous improvement on all of these various change ideas, some of which work and some of which turn out not to be very valuable and may get discarded. But we're learning our way into how to advance that improvement aim. So what happened in this work? For students in the traditional sequence, that 500,000 a year who went down the traditional pathway, 6% of those students achieved college math credit at the end of 1 year. 15% achieved at the end of 2 years. And even if you went out 3 or more years, that number never got above 20%. With the improvement work that I've just been describing very, very briefly, we got 50% of the students succeeding in 1 year. So we tripled the success rate in half the time. And now, this was original data, even as this work has expanded out to many more colleges, and that success rate has now risen to 70% students through this work of continuously improving, working on those various blue boxes that I've described. The other interesting thing that happens as this work moved out, because this originally started as a networked improvement community, we had faculty from about 20 colleges, 100 faculty where this group started the work. And as the work moved out to more institutions, one of the key observations in this work wasn't, well, are they doing it the way I did it, but recognizing that they will change it, that even as these initiatives develop and become more mature, as they move into new contexts, adaptations will occur. Some of these adaptations may weaken the outcomes, and on some occasions, they may actually be improvements. So we have to continuously be gathering data and looking at whether or not these changes, adaptations that occur out in districts, out in different colleges, are actually improvements. That's the kind of work that eventually got this improvement network from 50% to 70%. All right, so taking a step back now from these two stories that I've just, improvement stories, that I've just very quickly introduced to you. Each of these two cases is rich in particulars, and I could spend an hour or more on each one beyond this very quick introduction. But undergirding both of them are a set of principles that guide improvement and can inform improvement efforts of others much more broadly. And we call these the 6 principles of improvement that are anchored in improvement science. It starts with this idea of being problem-specific and user-centered. In both of those two cases, there were very specific problems. Initially, students dropping out, and then translating into how do we keep more students on track as they enter high school. In the second example, we've got these high failure rates in developmental math classes. Can we do better? In trying to understand these problems more deeply, we were user-centered. We went out and talked to students through empathy interviews. We went out and looked at more data to try to understand the flows of students through this system so that we can see it, not through our experiences, but through the experiences of the people who are actually going through it. We attended to the variability. You got to see the system that's creating these dysfunctional outcomes. So what is it about the way we organize the work of students? What is it about the way we organize the work of educators that's producing this unsatisfactory variability in outcomes? So those are the first 3 improvement principles, and they're all about how we go about more deeply understanding the problem we want to solve, because it's those understandings that begin to help us create this more productive, what we call a working theory of improvement. These are the things we think we have to now work on in order to get better at the outcomes. And then there's the actual processes of doing the improvement, which take us to the next two improvement principles. You can't improve at scale what you can't measure. So we have to embrace measurement. In the case of the work of attacking the high failure rates, students and dropping out of high school, it was the creation of this on-track measure. Well, what is it about what students are experiencing in that first semester in high school that made a difference? Getting information about their daily attendance as it was unfolding, getting information about their grades and how they're doing in their core academic courses. This became key to developing this on-track measure, which became key to informing all of the improvement work. In the work we were doing in community colleges with the developmental math problem, we had focused in on, remember, one of the big improvement efforts was we really want to work about how to engage students more productively in those first 2 weeks. And so we developed this very short survey, 2-minute survey that really asked questions about student motivation, engagement, their growth mindsets, their perceptions about belonging. Asked it in the first day of class and came back and asked it at the end of 4 weeks, because that would be key information about whether the changes we were trying in those first couple of weeks were actually, students felt more engaged, they were more oriented toward a growth mindset, and so on, and whether we were actually affecting improvements in those first 2 weeks. So have to engage measurement, and then we're constantly learning through, we're trying things and we're gathering data. Is there any evidence that this change is actually an improvement? And then there's the sixth principle, which is to organize as networks. As problems become more complex, and both of these were quite complex problems, we confront the limitations of our individual capacities. There's just a limit to how big of a problem any of us, whether it's an individual teacher or an individual school, can solve on their own. We need to organize as networks, because working together, we can achieve much more. Even in that little bit of the driver diagram for the community college work that I scoped out for you, and the actual driver diagram had many more boxes to it, you could see the scope of how much work was needed. And so you need a lot of people working together on the different parts of this if you're eventually to orchestrate all of these parts together into an initiative that substantially improves outcomes. So you can see the power of working together in improvement networks. We can learn and we can get much more, we can advance improvements much more rapidly working together than even the best of us can accomplish alone. Lastly, a few words about what it's like to do this work. Improvement is not some preconceived plan that that's been developed and you go and implement, but rather it's a collective work of a community working together, embracing these 6 principles. It's a colleagueship of expertise that is formed, involves researchers, it involves school-based educators. It may, depending on the work, it may involve leaders from parent and community leaders and students as well, so that it's bringing together, uniting very diverse forms of expertise in a community committed to solving some specific problems together. The work has an evolutionary character to it. As we try to improve, we learn more about the system and deep details about the system that has impeded the outcomes we're after. So we're constantly learning from the work how to get better at advancing the work. As such, the work of improvement is best conceived of as a journey. It's a journey in learning to improve. as you think about doing this work as a journey, it has a distinct character to it. At times it can feel exhausting because you're trying things. And one of the things about improvement work is we say we learn the most from failures. When we have an idea about something and we try it and it doesn't work, it pushes us to understand more deeply, what is it that's keeping us from what we're trying to accomplish? But this idea of learning from failure, nobody likes to fail. Learning from failure can at times feel exhausting. The work is also messy. You're working on lots of different things, and some of which will be productive and other parts of which will be not. So it's not simple. It has this character of being messy. You're living with a lot of ambiguity. At times it's just unclear. You're going to try something and maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. And you know what you're trying to get to, but the path from where you are to the aim, you can only see a certain distance ahead. And the rest, you just got to keep moving forward. And so this work has the character of being quite challenging at times, because you sustain yourself in terms of the belief of the importance of what you're working on and the way in which you're working. And it's a constant journey of just constantly trying to get better. So my closing advice to you as you take on this role of being an improver is that what's important in doing this work is to follow the principles, to keep those principles always present in your mind. And if you do, and you stay the course, you will eventually get there. You will actually move the outcomes and some aim, some problem you deeply care about solving. And in the course of doing this work, you have some resources to guide you along the way. The earlier book we wrote on learning to improve, we're delighted now exists, has a Spanish version so that it would be accessible to everyone. We have a more recent book on improvement in action, which tells more of these stories of actual improvement that educators have been involved in. And we're hoping that too will eventually become available in Spanish, so that you will also have these as guides to you in your improvement journeys. I wish you the best of luck with this. And again, it's been my privilege to share all of this with you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. This has been very, very interesting. And we have a couple of questions from people, and I will do my best to translate in the best way. We have one question from Adolfo, and Adolfo is asking about your opinion about teachers that are not necessarily prepared at universities or in teacher programs. So to this idea, which you mentioned before about, are we preparing teachers in the relevant contents? And he's interested in knowing your opinion in terms of, let me reread it so I can ask you the question. So I don't know.
As we began this work, we were working with educators already in schools. And so the initial work was always focused on how do we bring these ideas to them? How do we think about engaging them as improvers? Because not only teachers, but also heads of schools, principals, these have been systems that have been organized in which they're largely passive actors. Someone is telling them what to do. And part of improvement work is that this idea that people are doing the work, that people are on the ground floor, they need to become active agents. They have insights. They need to become active agents of improvement. And so that's a fundamental shift in the culture of educational professionals. As we got deeper into this work, we began to see that, well, we have to also take a step back and we have to engage our colleges of education the places that are preparing teachers and also preparing heads of schools, because their preparation also needs to engage them in how they can become continuous improvers. So it's a great question, because it is a paradigm shift in how educators think about themselves and the work they do, that you are now active agents of change, but we've not actually prepared them to do that. And we certainly haven't socialized them into, that's the work of being an educator.
Certainly it is. And there's another question about your recommendations of how to scale improvement in the general system, because at least what we can see is that we have to start small, and then what are the characteristics that are successful scaling up the system would have in those terms?
Well,
how it would look like.
In both of the examples that I gave, the initial networked improvement communities were small. They didn't come from the top down. There were researchers who were connected to educators who they could be called, in a different framework, you might call them early adopters, but they weren't adopting a program. They were coming together to solve a problem. What they learned things and they learned how to work with new tools, processes, and so on. So these educators in turn could become mentors to others, because these are learning problems. One of the key things about solving these problems is recognizing these are learning problems. And so we have to figure out, how do we orchestrate contexts where other educators can learn? And one of the best ways to do that is you have people who've actually done the work who can teach others to do the work. So that becomes very important in the early stages, because most people, in most cases, you haven't anybody actually solve this problem in these ways. And of course, as I said, they're evangelizing leaders, because we care about our students, and when suddenly you realize you can really make a difference in your students' lives, that's, it literally transforms the way these people go forward and go out. But then the complement to scaling is the systems then have to support this. So in the Chicago example, the leadership of the school system took notice of this, began talking about it, began getting senior leaders to have conversations with schools about it, committed resources to training staff. And so, the financial resources have to be brought in as well. In the case of the community college program, it was a little bit different, because here, the scaling of it confronted a political problem. Anything that has to deal with instruction in the colleges is the purview of the faculty. Even the presidents of the universities won't touch this. So, you got issues of what departments want to do or don't want to do, what academic senates are going to permit or not permit. So in this case, it came from the outside, where some in the civil rights community that were concerned about impediments to students of color moving forward in the education system started to pick this up and began to bring political action into this from the outside, to press on these institutions that weren't responsive. So this becomes, how you scale this becomes very context bound, whether you got system leadership that's then open to it, or the system leadership is part of the problem, and then the pressure's got to come through a different source.
Yes, it seems that you have to start adding people within the process.
Yes.
So the networking and how you work with others through the process gets you through the scaling up.
And it's in working with others, you're working with others to solve the problem, but you're also working with others in a kind of a political strategy. Because even when you're working small, you're anticipating what are the issues ahead for scaling, spreading the work, and what am I doing now? How am I building constituencies around this so that it could spread subsequently?
Yeah, it sounds amazing. We have another question from Jaime. Jaime is asking about the importance that you bring to, or you give to, distributed leadership at implementing these actions.
Well, in each of these, I talk about this as a problem of assembling a colleagueship of expertise. It starts with what's the problem you're trying to solve? And then you begin to think about, well, who do I need around the table to initiate this work? And who do I need to develop, in that sense, distributed leadership over time for this work to spread? So that in the, for example, in the community college work, well, there's a lot of research that bore on this problem from our secondary schools, but very little research on the same problem in community colleges. So I initially recruited people who are expert on mathematics instruction, on professional development of math teachers, and social psychologists who knew about the work on growth mindsets, belonging uncertainty, because as we begin to understand the problem, we begin to clear, well, we need to access to the best academic expertise, what we knew about English language learners. So you start assembling that. We were also starting to bring in some faculty, math faculty from the community colleges, because they knew the students, they knew the organizational context. They were select faculty. They were oriented toward trying to make a difference. But I knew we had to have the best of this kind of on the ground expertise joined to the best of what we knew from research. And since these were going to be institutional leadership issues, I also recruited a community college president into that initiating team. And then as they get started, we're working on growing the distributed leadership over time. So how do we develop the leadership of more faculty who can carry this forward? How do we develop the leadership of more university presidents and deans? Because initially the small team is bringing this forward, but what becomes most powerful for spreading the work is individual faculty talking to individual faculty, university presidents talking, college presidents talking to other college presidents about what we accomplished. So that's part of building up over time this distributed leadership capability for spreading the work.
Thank you. So I have a question about, well, you describe this process that it's very, it seems to me that you need to have certain skills, like leaders need to have certain capacities and knowledge about the process of improvement, and also some personal traits.
Yes.
It's a challenging process to go through. Some of us will not, will be frustrated through this process. So I want to ask you both, like, what kind of skills should leaders have to accomplish these kinds of processes successfully? And also, what kind of personal traits should be built as well? Because I don't think it's something that you cannot build, but you should be aware of what you need to go through this process to start doing it.
Well, there is a whole technical side to doing improvement. Behind each of those 6 principles, there are very specific processes and tools we use. I mentioned empathy interviews, how to construct the driver diagram, but there is technical knowledge to be learned. Improvement is a practice. So I strongly believe that individuals who are in roles of leading improvement should have experience in the doing of improvement. It's kind of an odd idea that you're going to lead somebody else doing work you've never done yourself. So yeah. There's opportunities to do improvement. So that's all part of the learning in a side of it. And then, as you said, there is a whole set of mindsets or dispositions. Leaders historically have been, they're supposed to be the better knowers. They know what's supposed to happen and they're telling other people to do things. When you're doing this work as a leader, there's much more of a primacy on humility and vulnerability. being open, listening to others, recognizing that, well, you may have some insights, but you probably don't know the answer either. And so there is a fundamental shift in that kind of mindset that you have to bring to this work for the leaders engaged in the work. So both of those things are part, I think, of leading improvement. And just as I say, improvement work represents a paradigm shift for educators in schools, it's also a paradigm shift for those who lead educational institutions. It's a very different way of approaching the work of leading change.
Thank you. And we have one more question. You described the core principles for improvement. And during these times of COVID-19, what do you think in this context what are the most relevant challenges that COVID-19 has left for us if we want to go through a process for improvement? What kind of things or challenges are left behind now?
Well, on the instructional side, certainly in the United States, and I assume in other places as well, teachers like overnight had to go from organizing classroom instruction to providing instruction virtually through Zoom and other media. There were an enormous number of changes that had to happen. And there was also an enormous opportunity in that to learn from those changes, what actually worked and didn't work. And some of that knowledge, I think, is likely to be quite valuable going forward, even once we hopefully, some point in the not too distant future, emerge into a post-pandemic period. At a much more logistics level, I had been doing some work with actually the Baltimore City Public Schools in the United States, and I helped them through coach them through some improvement work where they were really with very basic issues like, we got to get devices out to students and get students regularly connected to the internet, and how they could understand better what problems they actually had to solve, because some of what they thought were the problems actually were not the problems they had to solve. But by being user-centered, trying to understand how the system was working, being more problem-centered, it led them to change some of their efforts and achieve much better access across their whole community. So even though our work with them was really around instruction, as they pivoted to this access problem, they began to think about, well, how can we use these tools and methods that we're learning about to solve a very different kind of problem? And that's not unusual. We've seen this in many other contexts, that as people begin to take up improvement, it changes the way they approach other problems going forward.
Well, thank you so much, Anthony, for this interesting webinar. I think we went through a lot of different knowledge about improvement, and the examples were really great. They made me thought about so much. They made me thought about the way we are thinking about schools, and vocational schools in Chile have similar problems to the ones that you described here in your presentation. Most of the students are vulnerable as well. They have issues at staying at schools, and it made me think about this idea of knowing the problems that students are having through their trajectories will help us to understand how to help them to get there, to get to the end of the school, and then help them to even go farther and to have better opportunities in life as well. So I think most of my understanding after listening to your presentation is that we have to pay more attention to what students are telling us, their stories, their trajectories, data from them, as well as their teachers that know them better, and trying to help schools and leaders will we have the mission of helping them to maybe see through that stories and learn about data and how to use the data to actually help students. It's been a wonderful conversation with you, Anthony. Thank you so much for this interesting webinar, and also the audience for listening and participating so actively today. This presentation will be available afterwards at our website. It's www.silet.cl, and please visit our website afterwards. As Silet, we hope to continue organizing more spaces to learn and discuss subject that matters to the educational ecosystem. So we want to thank you again, Anthony, for sharing this time with us, and good afternoon to everyone, and best wishes for the coming holidays. I hope you have a nice Christmas and Happy New Year as well.
Thank you. And happy holidays to all.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and goodbye, everyone.